Picture this. Snow swirling through the air like a million tiny diamonds, catching the fading light of a winter afternoon. Jack Reeves stands at the edge of his property, arms crossed over his chest, watching as Diane Keller marches toward him, her designer boots sinking into the snow with each determined step. Behind her, a crowd has gathered, neighbors with their phones out, recording everything. "This is private property, Mrs. Keller," Jack says, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. 23 years in the army taught him how to keep his cool under pressure. "I've asked you repeatedly to respect the boundary line." Diane's perfectly made-up face twists into a sneer. "You think anyone cares about your little property markers? This is Lakeside Heights. We have standards here, and that," she points to Jack's lovingly restored 1967 Chevy truck, "is an eyesore that's bringing down everyone's property values." Jack feels the weight of the phone in his pocket, recording everything. The crowd shifts uncomfortably, but no one speaks up. Not yet. "You have exactly 1 week to get rid of that junk heap," Diane says, turning to walk away. "Or I'll make sure the HOA takes care of it for you." Jack watches her leave, the crowd dispersing with awkward glances his way. His hand tightens around the phone in his pocket, and the corner of his mouth turns up slightly. Little did they know that Diane Keller had just picked a fight with the wrong veteran. Let me take you back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, Jack Reeves had finally settled into his dream home. After 23 years as an Army helicopter mechanic and pilot, including 4 tours in Afghanistan, he'd saved enough to buy the modest lakeside property his grandfather had once owned. The 3-acre lot sat at the edge of Lakeside Heights, an upscale community that had sprung up around what used to be a quiet fishing spot. Jack wasn't like most of his neighbors. His hands were calloused from years of work, his face weathered from desert suns. While they drove luxury SUVs, he lovingly restored his grandfather's 1967 Chevy truck. While they hired landscapers, Jack worked the land himself, finding peace in the physical labor after years of military structure. Every morning, he'd wake before dawn, brew a pot of strong coffee, and watch the sun rise over the lake. The quietness reminded him of early mornings, on base, before the chaos of the day began. By most measures, Jack was living a simple but fulfilling life, respected in the community for his military service and his willingness to help anyone who needed it. His most prized possession sat in the garage he'd converted into a workshop, a partially restored UH-1 Huey helicopter he'd purchased as military surplus. The aircraft had seen action in Vietnam, and had been sitting in a government storage facility for decades before Jack rescued it. Restoring it was more than a hobby. It was a connection to his past and the men and women he'd served with. That December brought the heaviest snowfall the area had seen in decades. Jack had prepared for it, stocking up on supplies and making sure his generator was in working order. From his living room window, he could see his neighbors struggling with the unexpected weather, their luxury vehicles ill-equipped for the heavy snow. It was on one of these snowy evenings that Jack first noticed Diane Keller watching him from her window across the street. She stood there, arms crossed, as he effortlessly cleared his driveway with the snowblower he'd tuned up weeks before the first snowfall. There was something in her gaze, not admiration, but calculation, that made him uneasy. Jack knew Diane by reputation more than personal interaction. As the head of the Lakeside Heights Homeowners Association, she ruled the neighborhood with rigid adherence to regulations about everything from mailbox colors to garden gnomes. Her husband, Thomas, was some kind of financial executive who was rarely home, leaving Diane to channel her energies into neighborhood surveillance. Jack nodded politely in her direction before turning back to his work. He didn't notice the narrow-eyed look she gave his beloved truck, parked in his driveway under a custom-fitted cover, or the way her gaze lingered on his workshop where his helicopter restoration project sat. 3 days later, as the snow continued to fall, Jack was returning home from the hardware store when he spotted a car stuck in a snowbank about a mile from his house. Without hesitation, he pulled over. A woman in her 30s stood beside the vehicle, looking distressed in a coat that was more fashionable than functional. "Need some help?" Jack called, already reaching for the tow strap he kept in his truck. The woman looked up, relief washing over her face. "Oh, thank God. I've been waiting for a tow truck for over an hour, but they're swamped." "I'm Jack," he said, extending a gloved hand. "I live just up the road." "Jennifer," she replied, shaking his hand. "I was trying to get to my sister's house. She's expecting her first baby, and I wanted to be there." Within 15 minutes, Jack had pulled her car out of the snowbank and made sure it was running properly. "Follow me," he said. "The roads are tricky around here if you don't know them. I'll get you to your sister safely." Jennifer followed Jack's truck, navigating carefully through the snow-covered streets until they reached a house about 3 miles away. As they pulled up, a man rushed out to greet them. "Jen, we were so worried." He looked at Jack. "Did you help her?" Jack nodded. "Just happened to be passing by." The man clasped Jack's hand. "I'm Mark, Jennifer's brother-in-law. Please, come in for a minute. We insist." Jack hesitated, then agreed. Inside, the warm house was bustling with family members gathered for the imminent arrival. Jennifer's sister, Elena, sat on the couch, visibly pregnant and beaming. "You must be the knight in shining armor," she said. "Or rather, in a shining truck." Jack laughed, just being neighborly. "Are you from around here?" Mark asked. "I live about 3 miles down, near the lake." Jennifer snapped her fingers. "Wait, in Lakeside Heights? In that stone house with the big garage?" Jack nodded, surprised. "That's the one. I work with Diane Keller's husband," Jennifer explained. "She's mentioned your house before." Something in her tone made Jack pause. "All good things, I hope?" Jennifer exchanged a glance with her sister. "Well, you know how Diane can be." Mark changed the subject, offering Jack coffee and cookies, which he gratefully accepted before heading home. As he drove back, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that his simple act of kindness would somehow connect back to Diane Keller in ways he couldn't anticipate. The next morning, Jack was clearing more snow when a sleek black SUV pulled into his driveway. Diane Keller stepped out, dressed in an expensive winter coat and boots that looked like they'd never seen actual snow before today. "Mr. Reeves," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I understand you assisted Jennifer Taylor yesterday." Jack leaned on his shovel. "I did. Her car was stuck in the snow." Diane's smile didn't reach her eyes. "How neighborly. I'm actually here about another matter." She handed him an envelope. "This is a notice from the HOA. Your vehicle cover doesn't comply with neighborhood standards. It needs to be a neutral color, not that camouflage pattern." Jack looked at the cover. On his truck, a custom-made cover in the same pattern as the uniform he'd worn for over 2 decades. It's never been an issue before. "Well, it is now. You have 10 days to replace it." She turned to leave, then stopped. "And that garage of yours? I've received reports that you're running some kind of commercial operation. That would be a zoning violation." "It's not a business," Jack said, keeping his voice level. "It's a hobby." Diane raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow. "A helicopter is a hobby? Regardless, any external modifications to your property need HOA approval. I'll be watching." As she drove away, Jack opened the envelope. The notice cited regulations he'd never heard of, with potential fines that seemed excessive for something as trivial as a vehicle cover. He sighed, folding the paper and putting it in his pocket. This was clearly just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, Jack received 3 more notices from the HOA, each citing different violations. His mailbox was the wrong shade of black. His garbage cans were visible from the street for too long after collection. The American flag, displayed on his porch, was too large. Each time, he complied, making the requested changes while documenting everything. He spoke with other neighbors and discovered that many of them had faced similar harassment from Diane, but most had given in rather than fight. One evening, as Jack was finishing up work on his helicopter, there was a knock at his workshop door. It was Bill Thompson, a retired judge who lived 2 doors down. "Got a minute, Jack?" Bill asked. "Of course," Jack said, wiping his hands on a rag. "What can I do for you?" Bill closed the door behind him. "I wanted to talk to you about Diane Keller. I've noticed she's been focusing her attention on you lately." Jack nodded. "You could say that. You're not the first," Bill said, lowering his voice. "Last year, she drove out the Johnsons because she didn't like that they were operating an online business from their home. Before that, it was the Millers and their classic car collection." "Is there anything in the HOA bylaws that actually prohibits what I'm doing?" Jack asked. Bill shook his head. "I've read them cover to cover. As long as your restoration work isn't a commercial enterprise and doesn't create excessive noise or traffic, you're within your rights. But Diane doesn't play by the rules. She makes them up as she goes." "I appreciate the insight," Jack said, offering Bill a cup of coffee from his workshop thermos. "There's more," Bill continued, accepting the coffee. "She's been questioning people about you, asking about your military service, your finances, even inquiring if anyone has seen you drinking excessively." Jack's jaw tightened. "Trying to build a case against me?" "That would be my guess," Bill confirmed. "She's done it before. Finds or invents vulnerabilities, then exploits them. Be careful, Jack. Document everything." After Bill left, Jack sat in his workshop for a long time, thinking. He'd faced enemy, fire, navigated hostile territories, and survived situations most people couldn't imagine. He wasn't about to be driven from his home by a neighborhood tyrant with a clipboard. The next day, Jack installed security cameras around his property. Nothing obvious. but positioned to capture his property lines and any potential intrusions. He also began carrying a small recorder whenever he was working outside, just in case. It didn't take long for his precautions to prove necessary. 3 days later, as Jack was working in his front yard, Diane walked directly onto his property, marching toward his truck with a tape measure in hand. "Can I help you, Mrs. Keller?" Jack called out, his phone already recording in his pocket. Diane jumped slightly, not having noticed him working behind a tree. "Just verifying that your vehicle is parked the required distance from the street," she said, recovering quickly. "We've had complaints." "From whom?" Jack asked, approaching. "Her. That's confidential HOA business," she replied dismissively. "But while I'm here, I should inform you that several neighbors have expressed concern about the noise from your workshop. The helicopter restoration needs to stop." Jack maintained his composure. "The helicopter is a registered historical aircraft, Mrs. Keller. The restoration is protected under federal law for historically significant military vehicles. As for noise, I only work during permitted hours, and I've installed additional soundproofing in the workshop." Diane's eyes narrowed. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Playing the veteran card whenever it suits you. This neighborhood was peaceful before you arrived with your projects." "I'm well within my rights," Jack said calmly, "and I'd appreciate it if you'd stay off my property unless invited." "We'll see about that," Diane snapped, turning to leave. "The HOA board meeting is next week. I wouldn't miss it if I were you." As promised, the HOA meeting was contentious. Diane had placed Jack's property at the top of the agenda, presenting a slideshow of alleged violations complete with manipulated photos that made his well-maintained home look like an eyesore. "Furthermore," she continued, addressing the 20 or so neighbors gathered in the community center, "Mr. Reeves is operating what amounts to an aircraft repair facility in a residential zone. The noise, the safety concerns, the potential environmental impact, it's simply unacceptable." Jack waited patiently for his turn to speak. When it came, he stood calmly, thanked everyone for their time, and then systematically addressed each accusation with documented evidence, noise measurements, property surveys, and certification paperwork for his restoration project. "As for safety," he concluded, "I spent over 2 decades maintaining aircraft that carried our troops safely through combat zones. I assure you, my restoration work poses no danger to this community." The room was silent when he finished. Then Bill Thompson stood up. "I've lived in Lakeside Heights for 15 years, he said, "and I've never had a better neighbor than Jack Reeves. This vendetta needs to stop." Others began to speak up as well, neighbors thanking Jack for helping during the snowstorm, for teaching their kids about aircraft mechanics, for always being willing to lend a hand. Diane's face grew, increasingly red as the support for Jack mounted. When the meeting ended without any action against him, she stormed out, bumping into him deliberately on her way. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You don't belong here, and sooner or later, you'll be gone." The escalation continued over the following weeks. Jack found his mail tampered with, received anonymous complaints filed with various county departments, and even discovered someone had attempted to access his workshop one night when he was out. Each incident was captured on his security cameras, each piece of evidence carefully stored. But Diane was careful, always maintaining plausible deniability, always working through proxies or official channels that obscured her direct involvement. The situation came to a head when Jack returned from a veterans event to find his property had been visited by county officials. A notice had been posted on his door citing him for unauthorized aircraft storage and giving him 30 days to remove the helicopter from his property. When Jack called the county office the next morning, he learned that someone had submitted photographs purporting to show commercial helicopter repair taking place at his address, along with a falsified report about fuel leakage. It took Jack 3 days of calls, paperwork, and finally an in-person visit with his complete documentation to get the violation dismissed. As he was leaving the county building, he ran into Jennifer Taylor, the woman he'd helped during the snowstorm. "Jack," she said, looking surprised. "Are you okay? You look exhausted." Jack managed a tired smile. "Just dealing with some neighborhood politics." Jennifer hesitated. "Is it Diane? I heard she's been causing trouble for you." "You could say that." "Listen," Jennifer said, lowering her voice. "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I was at a dinner party last week where Diane was talking about you. She specifically mentioned getting the county to force you to remove your helicopter. She seemed to think it was very funny." Jack's expression remained neutral, but something shifted inside him. "Did she mention how she got the county involved?" Jennifer nodded. "She was bragging about having a friend in the zoning department who doesn't verify complaints if they come from trusted sources. She even showed everyone the pictures she took from your property." "Thank you for telling me," Jack said. How's your sister and the baby? They're wonderful, Jennifer brightened. Elena named her Jacqueline, after you, actually. She said you were her guardian angel that day. As they parted ways, Jack felt a calm determination replace his frustration. Diane Keller had crossed a line, trespassing, filing false reports, and potentially putting his legal ownership of a historical aircraft at risk. It was time to stop playing defense. When Jack got home, he sat at his kitchen table with a notepad, making a list. First, he called Bill Thompson and arranged to meet for coffee the following day. Then he contacted 3 former military buddies, one now working in county administration, another practicing law specializing in property disputes, and a third, who ran a private security firm. By the end of the week, Jack had a complete dossier on Diane Keller. His county administrator friend had pulled records of every complaint filed against Lakeside Heights residents over the past 5 years, showing a clear pattern of harassment targeting specific homeowners, always preceding their eventual departure from the neighborhood. His lawyer friend identified multiple instances where Diane had violated HOA bylaws and possibly state law through her selective enforcement and falsification of records, and his security expert had helped him enhance his monitoring systems to provide irrefutable evidence of any future incursions. Jack also discovered something interesting about Diane's husband, Thomas. The man wasn't just frequently absent. He was living a double life with a second family in another state. Jack had no intention of using this information. His quarrel was with Diane, not her husband, and he wouldn't stoop to that level of personal attack. As Jack compiled his evidence, he noticed a pattern in Diane's behavior. She typically targeted one homeowner at a time, focusing all her energy on driving them out before moving to the next. And she always seemed to escalate dramatically when her initial harassment didn't produce results. One evening, as Jack was reviewing security footage, he noticed Diane walking past his property, slowing to take photos with her phone. The next day, he received another HOA notice, this one demanding he remove the Huey from his property entirely, citing an obscure bylaw about military equipment. Jack smiled as he read it. This was exactly what he had been waiting for. The helicopter wasn't just any military equipment. It was a registered historical aircraft, protected under federal preservation statutes that superseded any HOA regulation. Diane had finally overplayed her hand. Instead of responding to the notice, Jack spent the next few days finalizing his plan. He verified that his helicopter was in working order, not to fly, but to ensure all systems could be powered up safely. He contacted several of his neighbors, sharing what he'd discovered about Diane's systematic harassment, and he made one very special phone call to an old army buddy who owed him a favor. The day before the HOA's deadline for removing his helicopter, Jack noticed Diane walking through the neighborhood with a clipboard, stopping to take pictures of his property from the street. His security cameras caught her smug expression as she looked at his workshop. That evening, Jack invited several neighbors over for a barbecue. As they gathered in his backyard, he explained what would happen the next day and asked for their support. Not by doing anything, but simply by witnessing. Everyone agreed, many expressing relief that someone was finally standing up to Diane's tyranny. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Jack was up before sunrise, making preparations. By 9 o'clock, several neighbors had casually gathered on their porches or front yards, pretending to go about their weekend routines while actually waiting for the show to begin. At precisely 10 a.m., Diane Keller marched up Jack's driveway, accompanied by 2 men in suits who she had introduced around the neighborhood as HOA attorneys, but who Jack had discovered were actually friends of her husband with no legal credentials whatsoever. "Time's up, Mr. Reeves," Diane announced loudly as Jack came out to meet them. "The helicopter needs to be gone today, or we'll be filing for an injunction and seeking maximum penalties." Jack smiled pleasantly. "Good morning, Mrs. Keller. Before we discuss that, I'd like to address your trespassing on my property over the past few months." He held up his phone, showing her a compilation of security footage. "I have 17 separate instances documented, along with evidence of you filing false reports with county officials." Diane's confident expression faltered slightly before she recovered. "You have no proof I filed anything, and photographing violations from public property isn't trespassing." "Except you weren't on public property in most of these instances," Jack replied, still smiling. "And as for proof of false reports," he nodded toward Bill Thompson, who had just arrived with a folder in hand. Bill stepped forward. "As a former judge, I took the liberty of requesting copies of all complaints filed against Mr. Reeves. Interestingly, they all contain the same grammatical error that appears consistently in your HOA correspondence, Diane, a rather unique misspelling of maintenance that occurs in documents you've written going back several years." The 2 men with Diane exchanged uncomfortable glances as Jack continued. But let's get back to the helicopter, since that's what you're here about. At that moment, the distinctive sound of rotor blades cut through the air. Everyone looked up as an Apache attack helicopter appeared over the trees, circling once before beginning a controlled descent toward Jack's large backyard. Neighbors came out of their houses, phones raised to record the spectacle. The Apache landed gracefully on the open space behind Jack's workshop, its rotors slowing as the pilot powered down. Diane's mouth opened and closed wordlessly as the pilot emerged from the aircraft and approached them. He was dressed in full military flight gear, his bearing unmistakably military. "Colonel Jackson," Jack said, saluting his former commanding officer. "Right on time." "Wouldn't miss it for the world, Chief," the colonel replied, returning the salute before turning to Diane. "You must be Mrs. Keller. I understand you have concerns about aircraft on private property." What is this?" Diane finally managed. Jack smiled. "This is Colonel Robert Jackson of the Army Aviation Heritage Foundation. He's here about my Huey. You see, yesterday I officially donated it to the Foundation's restoration program for historical aircraft. They're picking it up today, fulfilling your requirement that it be removed from the property." But that's not," Diane sputtered, pointing at the Apache. "That's not removing it. That's bringing in another one. The Apache isn't staying," Jack explained patiently. "It's just transport for the colonel and his team. They brought the trailer for the Huey." He pointed to the road where a large military transport vehicle was just pulling up. "However, before they take it, the colonel has something he'd like to address with you." Colonel Jackson cleared his throat. "Mrs. Keller, it has come to our attention that you've been attempting to force the removal of a historically significant military aircraft through potentially fraudulent means. This Huey is one of only 17 surviving aircraft from its unit, and its restoration is protected under the Military Historical Vehicle Preservation Act." He handed Diane an official-looking document. "This is a cease and desist order regarding any further interference with the preservation of this aircraft. Additionally, since Mr. Reeves has now donated it to our foundation, it falls under federal protection. Any further false claims or reports will be considered interference with a federal historical preservation project." Diane looked from the paper to the colonel to Jack, her face cycling through shock, anger, and finally fear, as she realized the depth of the trap she had walked into. The neighbors had gathered closer, many openly recording the confrontation on their phones. "Furthermore," the colonel continued, "I understand there may have been some question about Mr. Reeves's qualifications to maintain such an aircraft. Let me assure everyone that Chief Warrant Officer Reeves was one of the finest helicopter mechanics and pilots in the U.S. Army. He saved my life twice in Afghanistan when our aircraft was hit, and there's no one I would trust more with historical aircraft restoration." One of Diane's attorneys tugged at her sleeve. "We should go," he muttered. "Now." But Diane seemed frozen in place as Colonel Jackson turned to address the gathered neighbors. "In recognition of Mr. Reeves's donation, the Foundation would like to invite all of you to our upcoming air show, where this Huey will be featured once restoration is complete. Mr. Reeves will be honored for his contribution to preserving our military aviation history." Applause broke out among the neighbors. Several approached Jack to congratulate him, while others took selfies with the Apache in the background. Through it all, Diane stood immobile, the cease and desist order crumpled in her hand. Finally, she turned to leave, trying to maintain some dignity. As she reached the edge of Jack's property, he called out to her, "Mrs. Keller." She turned, her expression a mask of humiliation and rage. "I believe this belongs to you," Jack said, holding out a thick folder. "It's everything I've documented over the past few months. The trespassing, the false reports, the selective enforcement. I'm not planning to use it, as long as the harassment stops. Not just of me, but of everyone in the neighborhood." Diane didn't take the folder. "You think you've won," she said, her voice shaking. "But this isn't over." "Actually, it is," came a voice from behind her. Jennifer Taylor stood there with several other neighbors. "We've all had enough, Diane. The HOA board is holding an emergency meeting tonight. We're voting on new leadership." The transformation in the Lakeside Heights community was remarkable in the weeks that followed. With Diane Keller voted out of the HOA presidency and a new board elected, years of oppressive and selective rule enforcement came to an end. Jack was asked to join the board but politely declined, preferring to serve as an informal advisor instead. True to his word, Jack never released the evidence he had compiled against Diane, even when she and her husband quietly put their house on the market a month later. The rumor was that Thomas Keller's double life had been discovered, not through Jack's investigation, but through Diane's own obsessive checking of his phone after her public humiliation led her to question everything in her life. The Apache helicopter's arrival became something of a local legend, with embellished versions of the story spreading throughout the county. Jack's restored Huey did indeed go to the Aviation Heritage Foundation, but with a special arrangement that allowed him to continue working on it and to use his workshop for other restoration projects. Several neighbors, fascinated by his work, began stopping by to learn about aircraft mechanics. Jack found himself surprisingly at the center of a more united community. He started a veterans outreach program, connecting local military personnel with resources and support. Many of his neighbors, who had previously kept to themselves under Diane's reign, discovered a newfound sense of community. The following winter, when another heavy snowfall hit the area, Jack organized a neighborhood snow removal team, teaching everyone how to prepare for and deal with severe weather. The spirit of cooperation that emerged was a far cry from the isolated, suspicious atmosphere that had prevailed under Diane's leadership. 1 year after the Apache landing, Jack hosted a neighborhood barbecue in his backyard. As he looked around at the gathered families, kids playing, adults laughing, and sharing stories, he felt a deep satisfaction. Bill Thompson raised a glass in his direction from across the yard, a silent acknowledgement of how much had changed. Later that evening, as the party wound down, Jennifer and her sister Elena brought little Jacqueline to see the pictures of the Huey that now hung in Jack's workshop. The toddler pointed excitedly at the aircraft in the photos. "Someday when she's older, I'll take her to see it at the museum," Jack promised. "Maybe she'll be a pilot herself one day." "All because you stopped to help a stranger in the snow," Elena said, smiling. Jack shrugged. "That's what neighbors do. They look out for each other." As the last guests left, Jack sat on his porch, watching the sunset over the lake. In the distance, he could see a for sale sign being taken down from a house across the neighborhood, the third new family to move in since Diane's departure. The community was growing, changing, becoming somewhere people wanted to live. He thought about how a simple act, stopping to help someone stranded in the snow, had set in motion a chain of events that transformed not just his life, but an entire community. Sometimes standing your ground wasn't about fighting back. It was about creating something worth defending. Hey there, folks. If you enjoyed this true story of neighborhood justice, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more unbelievable real-life dramas. Have you ever stood up to an entitled neighbor or HOA tyrant? Share your experiences in the comments below. And remember, sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even, it's about bringing people together. See you in the next video.